Okay, then we will get started. Like I said, we are recording this as well, so hopefully everybody's here for the same thing, the Tackling Inequalities Through Sector Partners Fund, which we'll get into in a little bit of time. If I can just do some of the introductions and virtual housekeeping. Okay, so if everyone can keep themselves on mute throughout, that would help. And if the presentation is starting to get a bit jagged and what have you, if people can turn off their videos, that sometimes helps with the internet speed. Obviously, we're relying on IT systems to make sure this all works, but I think we're all finding out through the coronavirus period that virtual meetings can and do work for everyone and can work quite effective. So we will be using Microsoft Teams to take us through this. We will share the recording of the webinar later on as well on our website. So if you are aware that people have maybe missed this, that you want them to see it, then we will have a link and we will circulate that on email as well so that you've all got it. We are happy to take questions about the Tackling Inequalities Fund and anything else you hear on the webinar. If you could raise them via the chat function that you'll be able to get if you click in the middle of your screen usually and find the chat function. And then after today's webinar, for partners, for people that may well be funded through the Tackling Inequalities Fund, myself and the team will follow up afterwards with people and have further and more in-depth conversations. So we've got from Active Humber a number of people on the call today, but for this morning, you'll largely be hearing from David Gent, who is the Chief Executive of Active Humber. He's going to take us through the fund itself and what it means for the Humber area. Myself, Deputy CEO of Active Humber, Gary Sainty, and Nicola Massingham, our Area Development Manager, is going to manage that chat function for us. And when we get to the appropriate point in the webinar, she will do the questions and what have you for us as well. And the rest of the team that are listening, no doubt will be working with all partners and applications in the coming weeks. So today we'll hopefully keep it around about an hour no longer. We are going to go through three things, and the bulk of it will be the Tackling Inequalities Through Sector Partners Fund, which we'll get into in a minute. But there's also two other opportunities and important things that we just want to bring to your attention as well, and that's the Active Together Fund through crowdfunding and the Sport England's future strategy and direction as well. So without anything more from me, I'm going to hand over to David, and David's going to take us through the Inequalities Fund.
Well, thank you, Gary. Like I said, I'm going to talk through the details of the fund. And as Gary said, if you've got any questions or queries, please put them in the chat box. And at the end of the short presentation, Gary, Nicola and myself will do our best to answer your questions. And not the best title in the world, so we've shortened it to TIFF. So as I talk about TIFF through the presentation, it's not because I'm arguing with somebody, it's just the short acronym we're using for the fund name. So, introduction to the fund. The focus of this fund is to help reduce the negative impact that COVID-19 and the widening of inequalities in sport and physical activity that are happening at present. Insight from Sport England about COVID-19 is showing that and highlighting the widening gaps in activity levels across existing priority audiences. And that shows that some of those target audiences are suffering way more from the impact of the disease than is the case with the wider population. And that has the potential to further widen the gaps in participation that already exist for these groups. And those groups are lower socioeconomic groups, Black, Asian, minority ethnic communities, disabled people and people with long-term health conditions. And each of the active partnerships across England, of which Active Humber is one, depending on their population size and levels of deprivation, has received a funding allocation. The allocation for the Humber area is £80,000 to be spent between now and October 2020. This is phase one of the TIFF fund, and Sport of England have indicated that there are likely to be further phases. Why these groups? Well, some of the reason for focusing on these audiences includes people on low incomes, making an existing problem worse that has the potential to be exacerbated further by a potential slow return to normality and a contraction in the economy. B, disabled people and or those with long-term health conditions. This group are likely to be self-isolating because of the increased risk, and for that many, this is likely to continue even when the lockdown lifts. And C, B, M, E communities. People from this group are more likely to be working in key roles, either through health and social care settings or in wider sector roles. Why this approach? There's a lot of crossover between the 4 priority groups, and that can exacerbate the issues they are currently facing. For example, the gender gap continues to widen in the Humber and is exacerbated further when overlaid with the demographic characteristics of this fund. This emphasises the need for a holistic and collaborative approach to this work. And that's why we're Active Humber really do want to work with you as partners to ensure that TIF funding gets to where it needs to go, most needed and quickly. Now, the Sport England Community Emergency Fund, which you may have heard of, has reached many groups who are struggling because of the impact of lockdown and COVID-19, and it's been a great success. But TIF is not Community Emergency Fund Mark II. Sport England really do want TIF to reach out to those 4 key underrepresented audiences quickly and effectively in the way that other Sport England funds have not. Active partnerships must distribute that funding in partnership with the local partners, because in a more flexible way than can be done nationally. So what type of groups are we looking to fund? Well, there's these 6 characteristics. A lack of capacity. They may have that lack of capacity and confidence to make application for grants. They may need a more personal approach than traditional sports clubs. A lack of trust. The group may not trust government funding and national sources. Equally, they have no affinity with Sport England and what they do. The group is much more likely to trust a local organisation, network and people they know. They're busy. Many of the groups that Sport England would like to support are likely to be very busy now dealing with the immediate emergency requirements around COVID, and are not thinking strategically about their future funding and survival. They might not need much cash. Just small amounts could make a big difference to quickly address immediate issues. For other grants, well, the group may be eligible for other sources of funding, so it may be part of our role to understand the bigger picture and support this through a contribution from sport and physical activity. And finally, they may need to do a new approach. The group may need support to reimagine their offer that they can make to their communities now and post COVID-19. The proposed approach. So Sport England knows that these audiences and multifaceted approach is required, and TIF is going to be rolled out in phases, with each phase being informed by the previous one. But what Sport England want to see is that the need to move at pace in our collective response. Applications are not going to take months to be completed. An ability to get the resource moving quickly to where it's needed. And we need to get the funding out before October 2020, not by October 2020. And a flexibility to build on this initial funding with further releases of funding should we get spent up early on as the further need emerges. And also taking the learning already gained from our place-based working shows that local trust is a critical element in working with and reaching deeper into the community where the need is greatest. And that's where we need your help, who have that trust in those local communities. And we don't want to be prescriptive with solutions, but letting the voice of the community come through in determining what is needed and working at their pace. And we also recognise it's not only about the money, but some help and advice will also be needed. So what's the intended impact of the fund? Well, it's these 5 things: to help reduce the negative impact of COVID-19 and widening inequalities in sport and physical activities. I can't stress enough this is about the inequalities that those 4 broad groups are facing. Secondly, to minimise the impact of COVID-19 on activity levels in these underrepresented groups, which are already lower than the rest of the population. 3, to enable community groups working with those target audiences to continue to exist, retain the resources and capability to survive and thrive into the future. to provide funding for community groups with those target audiences to remain connected at this time, however that might be needed. And finally, to strengthen the relationships between all the system partners and community bodies working with these groups so that we're ready for the future and what might happen in the future. The role of active partnerships. Well, our role as one of the key sector partners of Sport England want us to deliver phase 1 of TIF, but we can't do that alone. They want to work with us because of our understanding with the Humber area, the target audiences for this sport, and most importantly, our connectivity to you as key sector partners. That's what they want to see through the fund, that local partners are making the decisions and ensuring the money goes to where it's needed. And therefore, Sport England really does, and we need to show this, that it is involved local authorities, VCS networks, and equality organisations to make it all happen. Other sector partners. Now, there is going to be a small number of national bodies which will also be funded, and once this is confirmed, the list will be shared with Active Humber. We anticipate those bodies will be organisations like Activity Alliance, Sporting Equals, Street Games. Sport England made it very clear to all active partnerships we need to work with these national partners to avoid duplication of effort and maximise the connection locally to the audience that Sport England seeks to support. What can the funding be used for? Well, hardship through funding, sport, they just haven't got the cash to do what they need to do now. Funding for groups to find new ways during this period to keep their audience active, offering advice and training support, and helping to increase resilience, capacity and capability of delivery bodies. And Gary will, at the end of this presentation, the questions, come back to some of the things in detail that the funding could go to. But Sport England recognise that many of these organisations that they seek to support through TIF will have a much wider remit than sport and physical activity. And that's why I want to say that while sports clubs are not excluded from this fund, that's not the primary purpose. It's to reach out to those community groups that may have sport and physical activity as part of their wider function in dealing with these 4 target groups. Application process. This is not a normal Sport England grant process, and active partnerships can explicitly solicit known and targeted groups, providing there's a clear rationale and decision-making process in place. And that's where we need your help to find those groups. It's recognised that often the application process can put many organisations off from seeking funding, so we want to keep things as simple as is possible. But we do need to comply with the rules of the National Lottery Act for distributors, and so although all the award decisions will be made at a local level, all communications with partners and groups will state that it will be subject ultimately to Sport England's approval. Funding criteria. Well, we're still to agree the actual final criteria with Sport England, but we've told Sport England that we wanted to host this webinar today, speak to partners before we can finally agree the criteria with Sport England. However, we're certain in the application for funding the following will be there. It will be for those 4 key target audiences: lower socioeconomic groups, Black, Asian, minority ethnic communities, disabled people and people with long-term health conditions. Show that the funding will either help the group to survive and or support their participants to remain active. There must be a clear financial need, demonstrate the existing relationship with the group has the target audience, not be a duplicate application for funding, and be eligible for Sport England lottery funding. So what are the expected funding levels? We expect that the grants awarded through the scheme will be small, i.e. ranging from £50 to a maximum of £10,000. And we expect that most of the awards will be towards the lower end of this scale. But we're open in our discussions with you of what that actually means. The process is designed to be simple, and we're not looking to add any additional criteria, but Sport England are open to this being considered, and we must agree that with them. Again, so we need your help and advice if you feel any extra criteria should be needed. Who do we support? Well, the recommendations must include the following: the recipient's organisation's name, the recipient's organisation status, e.g. community club, charity, sports club, etc., a brief outline of the use for the funding, the proposed investment amount, and the priority groups that the organisation wishes to support. Now, we believe this process will be not too onerous, and we can fill in the form on behalf of the organisation if that is what is required. And Sport England will consider the portfolio to be funded and confirm on a weekly basis approval to award, so we can get the money out very, very quickly. Eligibility for funding. Sport England funding requires recipient bodies to have a recognised constitution in place, so we'll not be able to fund activities promoting religious or political beliefs, individuals or any private business or profit-making organisation unless they're a social enterprise or community interest company. But how do we deal with unconstituted groups and sole traders? Well, Sport England, and we've stressed it to them, that in some cases the ideas that you will generate from within the community may come from individuals and or unconstituted informal groups. Where this is the case, the following options must be considered. Can we help fast track the organisation to be constituted with support from you or us? Or could we use another accountable body, such as a VCSE body, to support it and act as the applicant and manage the funds for them? The important thing is, if it's a great idea, we need to find a way to get it funded. Football. Sport England are currently in dialogue with both the Football Association and the Football Foundation in understanding and supporting the needs of football in this period. If we are minded to target funding into local football and community organisations, then we do need to let Sport England know as early as possible. So if you've got ideas in that, like that, please let us know, because it may be that the Football Foundation does the funding, not TIFF. Religious groups and lottery funding. Sport England is also acutely aware that some local religious groups involved in sport and physical activity will not be able to receive lottery funding due to the link with gambling, and are considering ways in which they may be able to address this. We'll update you on this as soon as we know more, but if you know of those sort of groups, please do let us know as soon as possible. Evaluation and learning. Well, it is a lottery fund, and therefore we do need to demonstrate its impact. So Sport England wants to understand through TIFF what are the best ways to work with these 4 target audiences from across the Humber. They want to capture that learning and the type of information and feedback they require of how have we gone about identifying needs within communities? What have we spent the funding on? Who have we reached? What difference the funding is making to organisations and communities? And what have we learned and changed along the way? How have we found working with Sport England this period, and what further support might we need from Sport England? This is not going to be a complex process, but they do want lots of fantastic, great case stories and examples of how the funding is making a real difference for these 4 groups in their local community. Communications about this fund. Well, Sport England will be publishing further information on their website in the coming days. They are carefully developing their messaging so that everyone understands that TIFF is specifically about the 4 target audiences in their community rather than the traditional sports clubs approach. Further support. So we at Active Humber very much want to work with you in a spirit of collaboration and shared ownership in how this fund is used across the Humber. Several of the team at Active Humber, including myself, will be working and supporting this work over the coming weeks and months. We're keen to hear what type of support you would find helpful, which groups you think need to be supported, to help us ensure the funding gets to those groups and communities that need it in your area now and to help them into the future. So please do share your thoughts and ideas through our email of info@activehumber.co.uk or with any member of the Active Humber team directly. So the fund is now open. It is a live fund, and as we know more when things develop, we'll be keeping you all regularly updated. And I do want to stress, and I've said it a number of times now, we really do want your help and assistance to get those funds to those 4 target audiences and do that in an exemplary way. And we also want to do it so that we can improve our chances for securing more funding in the possible future phases, because there's no guarantee of that. But if we can come up with lots of fantastic local schemes, that will put us in the best place for future funding. So That's all from me. Gary and Nicola will now pick up your questions from the chat box and then directly if needed. So thank you for listening, and over to Gary and Nicola to manage the questions and the answers. Gary.
Okay, thanks for that, David. Hopefully that's been really useful for people. If obviously people do have questions from what they've heard, please start typing them into the chat box and we will start answering them. Whilst everyone is just thinking about what they've just heard, and if they do have any questions, starting to type them in, I will just pick up on the points around what can and can't be funded through the Tackling Inequalities Fund. Things that can be funded that were eligible items for expenditure include staff costs, training costs, rent and facility hire, utility costs, IT costs, insurance costs, and there will be other things in there as well that we just need to know what the need is, why it's needed, and obviously then things can be funded. There are some things in there that can't be funded. David's gone through the majority of them already. One area which may well come up through applications is capital works, which cannot be funded. We already know, and it's worth saying, that there's a little bit of a grey area here. What capital works means from our point of view is refurbishment and development of buildings, effectively development projects that are capital based. What may well be eligible through this fund and would be worth having discussions with us and yourselves is where works are needed to get buildings and facilities ready for reopening as restrictions start lifting. So things like shields and screens and things like that. If that's what's needed to get buildings, facilities open and ultimately getting more people active, then we will have a conversation around what they are and why they are needed. So those are the eligible and ineligible costs. I will turn to Nicola now and see if anyone has put any questions through that we can answer.
Yeah, we've just got the one around what intelligence we have on any groups in the Humber that are already struggling.
Okay, we've got a couple of things. We at Active Humber obviously work with groups already and understand their needs, and will be having solicited conversations with some of them in terms of what their needs are now and in the immediate future. Equally, we've got all of the intelligence that are that partners have, and you are working with people within these groups as well. And then in addition to that, we have information now on the Community Emergency Fund. As much as this isn't Community Emergency Fund Mark II, like David said, we are aware that some groups have gone through and successfully gone through the Community Emergency Fund and got money through that. We are now also aware of those clubs that or organisations that have gone through and were unsuccessful, and some of them may be eligible for TIF as well. So we've got a great deal of information to start working through now and in the very near future. But equally, working with partners, we want to find out more and more information from community groups, working through the likes of partners to get that real understanding and find out what the need is.
Robin's just added something around the COVID-19 contact survey results. Also, should give us some more intelligence around that.
Yeah, absolutely. We have gone out to clubs and organisations and asked them what their challenges are during this time, and also we went out previously a few months ago before COVID-19 happened as well, and have an understanding of organisations that are providing sport and physical activity as well. So yes, we do have a couple of other data sources as well that we can go through.
Just something else, Gary. I know David's answered this on the chat box, but there's been a couple of queries about sharing the presentation.
Yeah, like I said, this has now been recorded, and we will put the recorded link onto the website later on this morning. So it will be accessible, and I've obviously got everyone's email addresses that have registered for this. We will drop everyone an email with a link as to where that is on our website so that you can have that as well. Any other questions We do have two other updates that we're going to go through. So if there aren't any questions now, but as you're still thinking about what's been said this morning, we can have a quick roundup at the end as well. Just any questions on anything that's been covered.
Just got another one. Do you want to do it now, or do you want to?
No, I'll do it now.
Hold on. So it's from Ali, and the question: leisure service providers play a key role in providing environments for priority groups to be active. Do you see this funding going directly to the priority group and the leisure provider being a partner, or could the leisure provider be an applicant and work up a bid or bids with group that access their facilities?
That'll probably be more towards the groups themselves applying and the leisure centre being a partner. There obviously is eligible criteria in there around local authorities as well applying for this. But I think this is one of those where if there is a great idea, we want to hear about it. And obviously, if it is a great idea, we then want to make it happen. So whether that be the money going through leisure, the money going through a group, as long as we're aware of what the need is and ultimately the route that we can match that need, then obviously we'll have that conversation as to where the money is best placed, who holds it, and how we get it out to the groups that need it. Okay, I'll take it that there's no more questions, but like I said, feel free to keep dropping them through if there are any other questions that pop up. So the other thing that's come up from Sport England is Active Together, which is a crowdfunding fund. So Active Humber have been working with Sport England and are piloting some work around crowdfunding. Crowdfunding is an online fundraising platform for you to work with your community to raise funds. Sport England have partnered crowdfunding and have put £1 million investment into this fund. The usual criteria still stands. Sport England's investment can match funds up to £10,000. More information is available if you access the link that's on there. And like I say, these slides will be sent around, so you'll have that link to get onto as well. In addition, Sport England are also holding some webinars, which have been useful for us to get a bit more of an understanding about crowdfunding, about how you make successful projects, what tips can make projects successful, and also provide some real examples of projects that have done crowdfunding, done it successfully, what they've learned from the experience. And on those webinars that are listed on the screen, projects will be available to talk to as well and share their learning and understanding. Fund that's come out, it's a piloted piece of work. It's certainly something new, a new approach that's come out of the coronavirus situation. Like I said, we're piloting some work with Sport England at the minute around this, and we would be interested with working with groups that might want to apply for the crowdfunding fund. Would be happy to support groups to learn alongside you in reality as to how easy it is to go onto crowdfunding, to work with your local community, with your customers, ultimately to fundraise for yourself. And like I say, I've been part of some of these webinars and previous work with Sport England, and it has been really successful. And we have seen lots of sports clubs and organisations across the country really benefit from crowdfunding. And it's great that Sport England have put a partnership together with Crowdfund and made this investment available as well. So, like I say, we do want to share that. The link is there. Again, you will have that for registration onto some of the webinars. A couple have already been. They have been really interesting and really useful. And obviously there's more scheduled for the future as well. So again, this is a fund that we would welcome your support in getting to groups that may well be looking towards crowdfunding as well. So I'm going to pass back to David, who's just going to take us through the final part for this morning, which is Sport England's strategy shaping and future direction.
Thank you, Gary. So Sport England were going to produce their new strategy, and then COVID-19 struck. So that's caused them to rethink about how they should best plan into the future. So the document that you see there, which if you go into their website, is there. It's not a draft strategy or plan, but it's intended to put a direction forward. And when you read the document, you'll see there's an even greater now emphasis on inequalities and inclusion, and the chief exec has made it very, very clear that that is going to be the focus into the future, building on all of the work that's gone on so far. And it's also got to be much more based at a local level with local communities. And the document was based on loads of conversations and feedback and learning. So that's a real strong theme that's come through the sporting community, that it should be about much more inequalities, inclusion and local communities. Now, what they're going to start consulting on this in July 2020, and what we would like to do is invite you all back to a second webinar towards the end of June, early July, where we will update you all on what's been happening on TIFF and what we've been able to progress so far and what we need to do with the next steps, but also pick up on the Sport England strategy consultation, because Sport England are very keen that it isn't just the national governing bodies and sport and active partnerships, but they very much hear from all of those community groups in those 4 target communities about how they can best help support those groups to be physically active at that time. So we haven't got a date for that next webinar, but we think it will be late June, early July, and please look out for that. And I'll hand back to you, Gary.
Okay, brilliant. So that is effectively the 3 things that we wanted to get through this morning with yourselves. I hope that the information that we've shared has been useful. I hope that you'll be able to see some benefits to the fund, and also be able to help us get that funding down to groups that are in the most need, in those 4 underrepresented groups that David's gone through. So just before we finish, I'm just going to ask Nicola quickly, has there been any more questions raised that we need to cover?
There was a question just as we moved on to the crowdfunding that David has answered, but it might just be worth picking up. So it was around the acknowledgement of the role of the VCSE sector in supporting those non-traditional groups and the non-constituted groups, but there's also an acknowledgement that there's quite a lot of these out there, and how do we plan to get that message out? And as I say, David has replied, but just for anyone that can't see the chat box, I think that's why we've held this webinar for the partners that we've invited onto it, so that we can support your connections to get the message out and about, so that as many of these groups know about this funding as possible.
Yeah, absolutely. Like I said, we can't do this alone. We do need groups to help us, and your networks are valuable in getting that information down and out to the right people. So over the coming weeks, as we start working on this, I'm sure we'll be sending out messages across our networks, which then we ultimately want you to share with your networks as well, so that we get the right information to the right people, and then hopefully some applications will come through, and the money then will get to the right people as well.
Just another one that's come through. Is the priority of the TIFF funding to engage those priority groups that were not active before COVID, or those that were active and we are supporting to remain active?
From my point of view, a bit of both. We ultimately are looking for people to be active during this time. We know how hugely beneficial it is. You will have your groups that you work with, and if they've got any sort of physical activity as part of their offer, then ultimately they're eligible for this fund, or certainly eligible for a conversation with us. If that means that activities are put on that might increase activity from previous levels, fantastic. Equally, if that is maintaining activity levels of those people that previously were in your groups and may not have been active as out of this, then equally that's fine as well.
Another couple, how quickly in terms of time are we looking at getting outcomes to the applications?
Yeah, so if this is relating to payments, i.e. once something's been made, we're trying to turn it around very, very quickly. Obviously, we do have to go to Sport England, and they are going to twice a week have a look at the dashboard and confirm any funding. And obviously, as soon as that's happened, we will be able to then make payments. In terms of communications, once it's approved, obviously we will be having a chat either directly to those groups or through partners, and we can certainly say whether or not we're putting it forward for a recommendation. And as soon as that changes on the Sport England dashboard, which will be Tuesday and Thursday afternoons, is when Sport England are going to be looking at all of the applications. Obviously, the very next day we'll be able to inform people as to whether or not it's been successful or not.
And the last one so far, this week the government review into disparities in risk and outcomes from COVID has been published. The review found the largest disparity was age among those diagnosed with COVID-19. I'm interested in whether older people would be seen as important within the 4 priority groups listed.
Yes, it's certainly important. There isn't a specific, older people are not one of the 4 specific areas, but there is obviously a lot of crossover with those groups. So this isn't necessarily about funding older people projects, but certainly there will be older people within those 4 groups that equally are in those inequalities, suffer inequalities rather, that we do want to speak to, and those groups are providing activities for them. So.
And Gary, just to follow on, our understanding from Sport England is that a bit later this month they're going to be relaunching the We Are Undefeatable campaign, and settling through that, and we don't know the detail of this or the rest of it, is that there is likely to be very specific programs around active aging and older people. But because equally we asked the question, well, why doesn't it have a focusing on in terms of gender? And Sport England's response was, we want to concentrate on these 4 groups at this moment, and those other groups in terms of gender and age, they will come later in a different programs.
Okay. Thank you, David. So if there are no more questions, we said at the outset that we'd try and get this done for in under an hour, which we have just about managed. So obviously our team will be working with groups and partners in the coming days and weeks to land this fund. You've obviously heard a variety of information today. If you want to have further conversations with us following this webinar and next week, we'd certainly welcome that. Like David said, you can get a hold of us either directly to any member of the team or via the info@activehumber.co.uk email address. But we certainly welcome to have conversations with you all in the coming days and weeks so that we can land this fund. So if there's no more questions, I've got nothing more to add. David, Nicola, thank you for your input into today's session as well. We wish you a happy weekend and look forward to working with you and landing this fund in the future. So thank you for your attendance there. I hope it's been valuable.